Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Hillary Dickman. I'm the Senior Assistant Director of Admission for Marketing and Communications at Colorado College, and I'm also a parent of 2 college students.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Vince and I will continue our conversation about an article that appeared in the New York Times by Stephanie Saul entitled, Lawsuit Accused Elite Colleges of Admitting Students Solely Based on Wealth. Our question from listeners from Alex, a student, and Alex wants to know, what do colleges mean when they say they have a no-harm standardized testing policy? And Hillary and I will answer that question. And it's great because both Colorado College and Connecticut College, and that's Hillary and Andy, who are in our co-host team, they both utilize a do no harm standardized testing policy. So you will hear from the admission officer that works with a do no harm testing policy every day. Then we'll have our final part of my 3-part interview with Rob Franek, editor-in-chief of the Princeton Review, on how you can use Princeton Review's 168,000 surveys to understand the culture of the colleges your student is applying to. For our College Spotlight, Kevin Newton is back for part 2 of 4 in a series he is doing entitled Safe Universities Abroad.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Friends, if you missed last week's discussion with Vince, you may want to go back and check that out, because in today's episode, Vince and I continue with the final part by discussing Stephanie Saul from the New York Times article entitled Lawsuit Accuses Elite Colleges of Admitting Kids Based Solely on Wealth. Now let's hear the second part of that discussion. The lawsuit is saying you claim that you were need blind, and the way you defined need blind, this is not an exact quote, but oftentimes the way people will define need blind, I took this from Peter Van Buskirk. Peter, you went to work for Peter back in the day almost, right?
Yeah.
I'm the VP of Enrollment of Franklin Marshall. He says, we don't look at your wallet when we make admission decisions. That's just a simple definition. We're not looking at your wallet when we make admissions decisions. So if you're explaining need blind that way, the way the schools say, well, the intention was to say we don't discriminate against under-resourced. We don't discriminate against under-resourced. So you can be poor, you can be middle class, you can be lower middle. We're not going to hold that against you when we read your file. So that's how schools have defined it. But the lawsuit is partly coming back and saying, you've explained need blind in a way that doesn't take into account that you were looking at people's wallets. And when I look at their defense, which is we don't do that, and you and I know that they do, we've all seen it. We see it every year, at least, and it's not always, by the way, the 10 to 20, $30 million type thing. A lot of times it's the combination of the alumni that maybe gave 20 grand 10 years in a row and was very active. And how they're treated different than the alumni that was a non-giver or non-involved. Like, it's not always, and not even 20 grand. It might even been 5 grand. You gave 5 grand for 10 years in a row. You're an active alumni and you're very different. Your kid is getting different treatment than someone who didn't do that. But we see it all the time at these schools. And like, who's kidding who that they don't do this? Like, if their argument's going to be, we don't do that, I mean, Harvard's had their Z list forever. I know the Z list is not exclusively for donors, but a lot of it is. I mean, go back and read The Price of Admission. I mean, that book exposed all of this stuff like 15 years ago, maybe almost 20 years now. Read The Price of Admission if you really want to know what goes on behind the scenes, listeners. That book exposed some of the really great investigative reporting about how money influences decisions that are made. So I also feel like the zeitgeist that we're in right now is very anti, elite schools.
Yeah.
And when you have that, that's the, the water you drink, the air you breathe, like that permeates and people are ready. I mean, it goes back to the endowments, taxing endowments. I know you and I on another recording coming up here pretty soon, we're going to talk about the backlash against Ivy League schools in the and Ivy peers in the recruitment process. We'll be talking about that shortly.
Right.
But there's a backlash there that, for a lot of reasons, whether it's wokeism, whether it's protests, with all these different things, I don't think you're going to find sympathetic juries. And I think, because I didn't think they were actually going to lose that last lawsuit, the 568 group and the 17 schools.
Yeah.
They had all bandied together with their intention actually was good. They were trying to keep the wild, wild west from happening.
Right.
Let's not have everybody throwing money at people so that kids aren't making decisions based off of who they really like. And these schools are very generous with their need-based aid. So they're some of the most generous. Like if you looked at their home equity policies, they were only counting like 1.2 times salary and capping your home equity. So these are some of those generous schools. And they said, but we want people making a decision on the merits of the school. Well, that got overruled, right? Like that, that was a cartel and you can't do that. You're hindering. So these schools have been losing. Then, of course, affirmative action, like they've been losing in the courts. And if their defense is going to be, we don't do that, I don't see how it's going to survive because it's going to go into discovery and it's going to, examples, like you said, Sarah Harbison, she basically came right out and said it. Like she worked there and 100% of those kids basically got in, they were untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're just going to have so much evidence from people saying, yeah, no, it does go on. And I remember when we had Rick Clark on not too long ago. Well, it was a little while ago now, maybe a couple of years. And he was making a point of how, like, if you listen to some people, we may as well just admit off of our jersey. The point he was making is that the way things are going, we may as well admit students just by the name of the school, the name on their jersey, because you can't look at test scores, you can't look at recommendations because they're biased. You can't look at writing because they're biased. A family gives $50 million to help your institution and it's supposed to be a non-factor. And he was like, that's where I draw the line, where this stuff is just getting insane. Like, of course, we're going to take into consideration someone who can advance our institution, with significant dollars. Like, of course, there's going to be a factor. Like, that can do a lot for our institution. But if their defense, the argument that, well, the way you define need blind, you made it sound like you weren't looking at ability to pay, but you actually were. I have a feeling that is going to, be seen as a cogent argument, and I think they're in trouble. But I could be wrong. I'm not a lawyer.
Right.
I actually didn't think they were going to lose the last lawsuit, and they did.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I would say what's interesting is I think that some of those schools it was more prevalent. When we had the discussion on the text thread, MIT, I thought raised a good point. Like you have, all the documents you requested, you found like one little example, but some of these other, like Georgetown, they led the article with Georgetown because there's a list.
Well, here's the thing, Vince. I literally had somebody this week say, why is Georgetown asking this question about my money on the front end? Why are they doing that? Like on the inquiry side. And I said, well, because they're really need aware. Like Georgetown is a prestigious school, but they're not a wealthy school compared to, like, look at endowment per students numbers. They're not in the top 100.
Wow. That's surprising to me. Wow.
Georgetown, NYU, those are a couple of the schools that are not really wealthy. And money has played a bigger role at those schools traditionally because they need to find full pay families and it's been prioritized in their process.
Yeah.
So, and they're also one of these schools, like, they'll say we meet 100% of demonstrated need, but, without getting too much into the weeds on that, people can contort that in different ways. And you can, like, they're one of the schools consistently that I'll see. Let's say I have a family that they might get zero money from Georgetown, and then another school might give them 40,000 off a need-based analysis, just because of how they look at home equity and how they look at assets, and how they look at a lot of different things.
Yeah.
That's partly because they don't have as much money as their overlap schools. So it is so plausible to me that there's a president identifying. I mean, this stuff just goes on. I mean, I actually never thought that it could be open to a lawsuit, but when I look at it, when I look at the angle the lawsuit is coming from, you said you were need blind, but you're not need blind for wealthy families. Because their point is, you're trying to make us look bad. You're trying to embarrass us. This is in the article. It says you're trying to embarrass us. You're trying to make us look bad. That was never the intent of that term.
Yeah.
That term was to say for middle and and working class and under resource, then yeah, we're not going to discriminate against you in the admissions process. That was the intent of need blind.
Yeah.
But I think they're going to have a hard time stacking up the way this, and just based on past rulings. So, I mean, there's already been a $284 million judgment. Again, that's a lot of money against 10 schools.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they got like 200,000 people in the wings. I mean, this could be incredibly costly to some of these schools.
Yes. Yes. Well, we're about to see the impact of, here in California, your alumni status, with, USC and Stanford Stanford already came out with their early action single choice, but USC will come out potentially this Friday. And I'll be really interested to see, those children of alumni, how they fare, because USC loves.
You know what, Vince? I think we need to give some context, because we never
Sure.
really. I wanted to do an article, and we never really did an article. But basically, what Vince is referring to is California passed a law that said you can't use legacy in admissions, and the law. Some of the states that passed that law have only done it for public schools,
Yeah.
but California did it for private and public. So that's what Vince is referring to, and he says it's going to be interesting because now the schools are not able to use legacy. But the thing is, there's never been anything that's come out that I've seen that says they can't use donations.
Correct. But that's probably in the offing after this lawsuit gets more publicity. That's why I'm so interested to see the outcome of this, because I think, like you said, Mark, I think they're not going to be able to hide anymore.
You know, it's going to be interesting to me to see if schools start shifting their language on need blind and how they articulate it, because
Wow.
we've seen, we've seen this over the years, right? Like, wasn't that long ago, there were a lot of admissions officers that would have a title. I mean, Julie and I have had this title in the past, like multicultural recruiter or something like that.
Yes.
And then you started seeing it going toward diversity, and then it started going toward like access and like more non-racial terms out of like the backlash against affirmative action.
Yeah.
And that's what you see. You start to see the change in the nomenclature to protect yourself against the legal assaults. And so I'll be interested to see if people start like being very careful. I bet they will. Like, I'm talking about schools not in the 17, because this is not something that just these 17 are doing. I mean, I worked in fundraising and development for a year. Like, this is what you do. I mean, I was doing this early 01. And back then we had software that, we paid money for to assess the potential of everybody within your constituency. And, this is all really secretive stuff. You're having, you're running these reports and figuring out what people's capacity is, so that when you make an ask, you don't lowball. You don't ask for 10 grand if this is someone who you should be asking for a 7-figure gift from.
Right.
Like, this stuff was happening 25 years ago. I was a part of it, so you can imagine how much more it's advanced in the information age. But the point is, this happens everywhere. This is what you do in fundraising, and this is what you do And this is something that's not talked about in admissions because, it just would appear really gauche. Like you're talking to an audience in an information session. What are you going to do? Talk about this? Like nobody in the whole group it relates to?
Right.
Like you're just going to discourage them. But this is very much a reality that big donors, active alum who are consistent quasi donors, friends of the board, friends of the president, people with potential, celebrity, politicians' kids, is a different standard. I mean, it's just one of the things we've talked about when we talk about what's a hooked applicant. This is a
Right.
category that we've had, right? Along with others like, faculty and staff and athletes and others.
Right.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts?
I can't wait to see how this all shakes down because it's going to be there'll be another wave of laws that
Can you believe, though, Vince, that they have the temerity to say we don't do that? Like, did you see the quote from the University of Pennsylvania in the article?
yes,
You want to find that? Are you able to find that quote right away? I mean, it was incredible. Like, they basically came out and said,
it was Sarah Haberson testified last year in a deposition in the case that the BSI tag meant that a student's family was a big donor or had connections to the board.
but she was blowing the whistle. The defense from the schools, we don't do that.
And then this is what Penn said.
Yes.
In an emailed statement, Penn said it saw no merit in this lawsuit, arguing that the case was intended to embarrass the university about its purported admission practices on issues totally unrelated to the case. The actual evidence in the case makes clear that Penn does not favor admission students whose families have made or pledged donations to Penn, whatever the amount. The statement added, in fact, the university takes great precaution to ensure that no such preference is given. As a result, only qualified candidates are admitted.
I mean, no preference, no matter the amount. Like, if they think I just don't see that's not going to stand up to scrutiny.
Well,
You're going to be able to haul other people in, beside Harbison. They're going to blow the whistle on that.
yeah.
And when you go into discovery, I mean, I look at the stuff that Harvard had to share in discovery in the affirmative action case. They can get a lot of stuff in discovery.
Here we go. That's why I said, there's going to be a lot of dirty laundry coming out.
Yeah.
I just hope people are ready, and probably more laws out on the back end, especially in states where there are really selective schools like Virginia, North Carolina, Michigan, New York, California, maybe other states. Of course, Massachusetts as well, for sure. But yeah, a lot of those 17 schools, I think some of them won't have, MIT, I think, does a pretty good job making it clear that you get in on your own merits. But some of the other schools like Georgetown, 80, a list of 80. Wow. That's a lot of space.
I mean, I don't know. To me, this is just, I don't know. It's just so obvious that this is what's going on. I mean, do research on Harvard's Z list.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, so it's like, I don't know. I just cannot believe the effrontery of these schools to say we don't do that. Like that quote from Penn said, no matter the amount, like non-factor. Who's kidding? Who's kidding who? Development offices have conversations.
Yeah.
This is like this person could be very influential for our goals, and this stuff happens.
Yes.
I mean, you're not going to hear about it from an admission officer information session.
Yeah.
It's all hush hush.
Right.
Well, let's revisit it and come back and talk about it when the decision is made. But it's probably one worth following.
It sure is. It's going to be a hot topic for sure.
Thank you, my friend.
You're welcome.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Friends, we love it when we get student questions. And not only do we have a student question, we have the perfect person here, Hillary, to answer this question. So I'll play the question and then you'll see why.
Hi, I'm a mom from New York with a senior in high school who is currently going through the college admissions process. I've heard you mention several times on your podcast about a do no harm standardized testing policy. Can you explain how a do no harm testing policy works? Thanks so much for your podcast. It's been an invaluable resource for our family.
Take it away, Hillary.
Thanks, Mark. It's so good to be back. Yeah, so Alex had a question about the no harm testing policy and kind of wondering what that means. So I'll go into that a little bit. So for schools that have a no harm testing policy, I think all the schools that have no harm are test optional, but don't quote me on that because the number of no harm schools is growing each year. Typically, they're test optional. So just like with a normal test optional school, you can decide whether or not to submit scores. If you choose to submit scores, the people who are reading your file will make sure that if your test scores would make it harder for you to be admitted to the school, that they won't be considered in the review process. So if they're not strengthening your overall application, they're not being considered. I know that it can be really hard to understand how that is possible. And I don't know how each school does it. I know that each school reads test scores differently, right? I've had some conversations with reps from other schools, and we've talked about the ways that we see test scores, and every place is a little bit different. So I can only tell you how we think about it at CC. At CC, and I think this is true with most schools, test scores have always been part of the academic rating or the academic review in our holistic review process. And so always we have looked at transcripts and we have looked at test scores, and then we have sort of like recalculated the transcript into an academic rating that's not, it's sort of like a GPA, but it's a different number. It's a whole number. It's not an average. So we would recalculate your GPA into an academic rating, and then we would add in your test score if you submitted that as part of your academic rating. And we can see from past experience what we would expect a student's test score to be based on what their transcript looks like. So when we recalculate the GPA, we can say, well, if a GPA is 3.5, we would expect that student to have an SAT score of 1200 or above. I'm just making these numbers up. These aren't our actual numbers. I don't know them off the top of my head. And so that's just based on our past history, right? So if we are dropping a test score because we know that it's not going to strengthen a student's academic portion of their application, that's because we've looked at their transcript and seen that their transcript is really strong, and then looked over at their test score and said, ooh, for that transcript, we would expect the test score to be a little bit higher than that. So we're not going to include that test score in our review. Instead, we're just going to increase the weight of the transcript. So we're pulling out the test score, not considering it anymore, and making the transcript matter more. And the reason that we know that we can do that at CC is because we know that a transcript correlates better with success at CC. It's a better predictor of academic success at CC than a test score is. So it benefits the student because then the student doesn't have to stress out about whether or not to send their test score. And it benefits us because we can keep that student in the pool then, and we can maybe admit them to CC knowing that we have all of the information we need from their transcript to know that they're going to be a really strong applicant to CC. The other way that it can benefit students is, and I find myself kind of leaning on this a lot, is sometimes we'll have students, like my territory includes the Four Corners part of Colorado, so down by Durango. And there are students down there in the Four Corners of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, who live on Native American reservations, who live in places where they maybe don't, I don't know if you've heard, but Navajo Nation does not have running water in a lot of their housing there, right? Like these are students who have grown up in poverty and who have not had access to test prep the way that my students who I read from Boston have had access to test prep. And so when I'm reading a student from there, I'd really like them to submit test scores, because if I see an 1160 or a 1200 from a student where the average test score is maybe 900, that's a really bright student, and I don't want to discount that test score. And so by being no harm, we hope that we have made the process easier for students so that they don't have to really try to dissect our mid 50th percentiles or any of that kind of stuff. And also encourage students who might feel like, well, my test score can't compete at CC, but it sure can compete at my home school. I want to see those test scores. And so hopefully by giving them the assurance that, like, we're no harm, I'm not going to let this test score hold you back from being admitted to CC, then I can see those test scores where they're really outstanding in context.
I love the example you gave there, the Navajo area. I think that's helpful for families in understanding the importance of test scores in the context of the school that you're coming from. And it's not what people tend to think, which is, and it's how I was trained for the most part, which is it's the only nationally normed, number in the file, and therefore it has meaning. And you're, contextualizing it to the areas.
And that's not to say that when I read my students from Boston, like I've got some kids who go to independent schools in the Northeast where the average test score is 1450 or 1500, right? That's their 50th percentile. And if I get a student who is below that, if their test score is stronger than their transcript, I'm not holding that against them, that they come from a place that's ridiculously competitive where students have really great access to test prep. I'm really just looking at them and looking at their transcript and how their test score compares to it. And if their test score is stronger than their transcript but weaker than their school's average test score, that doesn't mean anything to me, right? Like I have the opportunity to let that student keep their test score so that it pushes them forward in our process. I really think about the context when it's that the student has a low test score compared to our mid 50th range, but they're high for their context. That's something that I want to be able to highlight when I'm advocating for a student.
That's a really important point, Helen. I'm glad you brought that up because we've had more than one question that's come in that, where a person has felt like they're going to be disadvantaged because of the school that they're coming from. So just for you to break that nuance out like that, I think would be really helpful to a lot of listeners. And we have more listeners from that greater Boston area than we do from the Navajo area, area. So I think that part of the example will probably more people will relate to that. So here's a question that I can think that someone probably has. Well, you say it's do no harm, but how can you not forget the number that you've seen and read the file knowing that this person got a 20 ACT and that's not competitive and they're not from the Navajo area? And so how can that not influence how you read everything else because you can't unsee a number? So what would you say to that?
Yeah, so two things. First, remember that I'm reading a lot of applications, and this makes it sound impersonal, but it's going to be really hard for me to remember individual test scores and remember who they go with, right? So that's the first part. The second part is it's just math. What we come out with when we create your academic rating is a combination of your transcript and your test score, or your transcript sort of with added weight to it, right? Because we're just looking at your transcript. And when we look at that academic rating or recalculated GPA, it doesn't say this is just the transcript or this is the transcript plus the test score. It's just a number. And so I will have seen your test score, probably, not necessarily. The person who looks at your transcript first before me is going to be the one who sort of does those calculations. So probably I will have seen your test score during the review, but it's because it's not a formal part of the review in terms of breaking out and knowing your academic rating is transcript plus test score versus transcript plus transcript. It's just not something that I pay really close attention to. I think that people would be really surprised how quickly we go through that part of the reading, because once we've looked at your transcript and we know where you are academically, and we have a number to help us understand like how you've done academically in high school, and perhaps that also includes your test score, we move on because we've got a lot more reading to do. We don't dwell on it. And it's just one part of the greater review of your application. It's not the whole thing. And we don't have time to like memorize who had low, I'm using air quotes again, test scores and who didn't.
Yeah, I think one thing that would be helpful for people to understand. So schools have an academic rating. Almost everybody does,
Yeah.
right, in their rating system. You'll see different numbers, 1 through 5, 1 through 7, 1 through 9, different systems that are out there. We used a 1 through 9. So let's say, and even with that, high could be good, low could be good. Like different people do it differently. So let's say you're doing a 1 through 9, and like 1 is like top of the top, creme de la creme, and then it goes down from there. And let's say, usually your admits like 1 through 3s are pretty really solid academically. 4s and 5s, could maybe be waitlist type people. And once you got to 6 through 9, you're sort of in shaky territory. So once you get your academic rating and you get that number, which is way more than the test score, right? It's all the it's just even more. It's going to be the grades and the rigor.
Yeah, it's 3 years of grades and rigor in academic classes.
Yeah. And at many schools, where you are applying into a major or you're applying into a college, it is also going to look at fit to major. So if any number that someone's going to remember, it's going to be your academic rating number.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the number that's going to be ensconced in someone's mind, not what the average person thinks. It's the 1350 or it's the 22.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe that will help people to know like all this gets put in context and gets converted to an academic rating. And then there's also a personal, like, different schools are different. We did a threefold thing. We did an academic, a personal, and extracurricular. Some combine the personal, extracurricular. What do you guys do, Hillary, on that, on your rating system?
Yeah, we have an academic rating and a personal rating. And the personal rating is, basically all the rest of your application.
Yeah.
So it's your activities, it's your supplement, it's your personal statement. All of that is encompassed in your personal rating. And I think it's really important for people to know that, like, when we create your academic rating, it's not subjective. It's not like somebody just looks at your transcript and your test score and goes, that seems like a 9 out of 10 to me, or that seems like a 5 out of 10. Like, it's math. We use math to do it, right? So we identify, how many rigorous courses you've taken across a variety of academic subject areas and what your grades are. And all of these things are counted and put into numbers just like you would do to get your GPA. And then that is how we come up with your academic rating. It's not just like the whim of however the admission rep is feeling that day.
Susan is either doing a backflip or a cartwheel right now because this is one thing that she really has wanted people to understand is like a lot of the subjectivity is taken out of it because of the training that you get as to let's just use the system we use 1 through 9, like what a 4 looks like, what a 2 looks like, what an 8 looks like. Like you don't just get to say, oh, I like this kid's an 8 or this kid's a 1 or 2. Like there's systematic training and even schools can even look and see how people, are rating kids and calibrating and
there are
all of that
multiple
come into
readers
place.
involved too, right? Like
Correct.
When we're thinking about how demanding was this student's curriculum in high school, we're taking into account what the counselor says. We're taking into account what the first person in our office who looked at the transcript said. We're taking into account the territory rep and the person who's reading with the territory rep. And then if that student is going to subcommittee or to committee, there are as many as 13 to 15 people who are looking at this and together saying, okay, well, if this school offers, 21 AP classes and this student took 7 AP classes across 4 different subject areas, we're going to say that that's the most demanding curriculum available at that school. And that is going to be consistent for all the students in that school and across other schools that also have 21 APs available, right? So that's sort of how, if we're thinking about the rigor of a school, like it's going to be consistent. so that you're measured within your context, but also like we have a way to sort of think about your context compared to what is going on in the rest of the world. We had a really interesting interaction with some folks who have a special outside scholarship that's available to CC students, and they've been considering like passing some of the burden of reviewing those scholarship applications to us in the admission office. And they wanted to hear like how do you do the work that you do? And so Matt went over to their board meeting and explained to them how we review admission applications, and they were like surprised that it was systematized, that it wasn't just like, oh, I like this student, or oh, I don't really like this student. Like that it's a system, and we tweak it a little bit every year, and then we train on those tweaks, and we spend a lot of time norming, and we work really hard to be as consistent as we can so that the system does most of the work and takes the bias out of it, so that when we're creating an academic rating or a personal rating, but especially the academic rating, like there's just not a lot of room for judgment, right? Once you've been trained on how the system works and what is a most demanding curriculum versus a very demanding curriculum versus a demanding, like there are actual sort of protocols that go along with that, where we're not just like using whatever we feel like for a rating system. It's really consistent across students from one school and across schools.
And I know this may be confusing, but all that can be true. But then on the personal side, there still can be room for some inputs. Like let's say a kid just has presence, and when they walked in, they just light the room up, and you notice that when like there's still a place to communicate and incorporate that in some component of the personal piece. Would you say that's fair?
I think it's probably different from school to school on how that's incorporated, but my sense is that comes in more in the comments that we leave than it does in a numeric rating, right? It's pretty straightforward to say whether a student's activities are like sort of at the very top end of what's available to students for activities at that school versus being, something where the student isn't very engaged outside of the classroom. That's pretty easy to identify, like on a ratings scale. What you're talking about, like their presence, whether that's from an interview or from some other interaction with the student, that's a little bit different and shows up more, I think, in the comments, in the summary comments when you're writing about a student, or when you're advocating for a student in subcommittee or in committee. And then you're really trying to like kind of convince the people around you of what you see in that student. And that is very different from the academic rating or the personal rating, that are sort of the things that push most students into, being admitted to a school.
No, that's a really important distinction. But I want to make sure we capture that there's still a component of that. Like this is not just completely robotic. It came out, when I interviewed Christoph Gutentag, and I asked them, why do you like Glimpse videos? Like, and he said why he likes Glimpse videos, that was a component of this other piece that still can get factored into the process. And so
I think it also depends on whether you have like an official sort of rating for that component of the application, right? And like we don't have because we're only seeing the Glimpse videos in the Questbridge students right now, we don't have an official way to sort of rate those. So it goes more into the comments. If we were to have a numeric rating where it gets incorporated into their overall personal rating, then I could see, yes, like you have to have a rubric by which you choose the ratings for those students. And so even then, like I just would say anything that we are adding a numeric rating to, there is training and there's a rubric, and yes, people can be moved slightly more in one way than the other, but we really spend a lot of time trying to norm and make sure that we're consistent across readers, so that our personal biases, the ways that we're moved by students, aren't the thing that determine a student's future at our college.
That's very well said. And schools can differ on how they, let's just use a glimpse video, whether it gets incorporated into some
Yeah.
component of the personal rating, or it's just side comments.
Right, for sure.
That can
I think
differ
it's
from
the
school
same
to
way that
school.
a portfolio can be sort of
Correct.
extra, or it might be part of the formal review. There are lots
Yeah.
of those parts, right, that aren't. I mean, they're part of the review, but they're not formalized in a number anywhere in a rating system. Those are sort of more of what pushes conversation about a student forward, because it's really easy to see what their ratings are in different areas. But what is interesting to have conversations about are the things that aren't rated. And that's where more of the human element comes in.
You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of when I was interviewing Courtney Minden when she was over the admission office at Babson, and I was asking her the question, are interviews evaluative or informative? And she said they're informative, but then she said, and then I asked her, does a write-up go into the file? And she said, yeah, basic write-up goes in the file, but it's still informative. And then I asked her, well, if it goes into the file as a write-up, couldn't that be interpreted as evaluative? And then she said, well, if somebody walks into our reception room and they're rude to everybody, like, we'll take that into consideration, but we don't have like a formal system for like ranking that.
Yeah.
And so there are lots of sort of atmospherics that may make an impression overall, and it's still a human process. And I think as much as you standardize things, there's still going to be a human component to
Yeah,
things.
for sure. We try to eliminate as much of that as we can, but part of human nature is that we are all going to have biases that come out. But reading in teams and using a committee process and training as much as we can, norming the process as much as we can, like all of those things are things that we do to try to make sure that there's as little bias as possible. And always there's going to be bias, and there are going to be other things that play into it too, whether it's that the student didn't turn in their financial aid documents and we can't admit students who haven't turned in their financial aid documents.
Sure.
Or like there are lots of things that go into this process that that are sort of, I don't know, harder to predict or harder to sort of see behind the curtain. But the testing part of it shouldn't be a part that is sort of obscured. That should be a part that's pretty transparent. And so we've tried to make it as simple and as transparent as possible. And yet you still have to trust us for part of that, right?
Friends, as I was editing this episode, I thought of something that I feel is really important to insert here. I really don't want listeners to come away thinking, now I know how colleges read admission files. Personally, I really believe in whole person admissions, which is most often called holistic admissions. I believe in it to my very core. It is a type of file reading that takes the context of the student and their personal qualities into consideration. And I believe that it's very important. It is admissions at its finest. And I've intentionally selected co-hosts for our podcast with that background and training. All 5 schools Andy Strickler worked at have done whole person admissions. The 3 schools Susan has either worked at or read for have done comprehensive whole person admission. You just heard the nuance that Colorado College considers when they read a file. Ditto for Vince and the 3 schools he worked at or the 3 others he read for. And for Julia, the school she worked at and the school she read for. But I want you to know, it is not how everyone makes admissions decisions. I worked for 2 schools, one college, one boarding school. One did comprehensive, holistic admissions, and one didn't. There are 2 colleges I visited in 2024 that had one person who made the decision for her territory. And while there was a little guidance they were given in how to make decisions, some schools' processes are so numbers driven, they refer to the people recording the decisions as processors. It was nothing like the complexity you've heard here from Hillary and I that we just discussed. So when you hear from Hillary or Susan or Andy or Julia or Vince or me, or what you're going to hear the next 3 Mondays when we get into how Duke's admission process works, and we're having these very nuanced discussions, this is the norm at highly selective schools, especially highly selective private schools, but often also at highly selective public schools, where they have so many kids with mostly A transcripts. And they not only need to go beyond just a number or letter grade to interpret the academic performance, but they're also building a residential community. So they're greatly concerned with personal qualities that the students they admit bring into the dorms, bring into the community. If your student is applying to Arizona State or Middle Tennessee State, a couple examples, the process is as simple as looking at your transcript and determining if you have the requisite GPA. At the Cal State schools, they are looking to see that you have the requisite A through G courses, and they're looking at fit to major, rigor, grades, and grade trends, but no recs, no interview, no testing, no writing is in the file. No comprehensive whole person review. So admissions is very different at the 2,275 four-year not-for-profit schools that award bachelor's degrees in this country. So, Hillary, how much communication have you had with other people that have a do no harm? Because it's spreading, right? I mean, I'm pleased. I'm seeing it. Chicago, Texas A&M, TCU, Connecticut
This
College.
fall when I was traveling, I talked with a lot of reps who said, "Oh, I wish we did that," but I didn't run into any who were doing a no harm policy yet. Actually, that might not be true. I think I was sitting near the Denison rep at a fair, and we chatted about it for a minute, but we didn't have time to really dig into details on how we each process things differently.
Isn't this year 2 for you? Isn't
Yeah,
this
this
year
is year
2?
two.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So a lot of people are in year 1,
Yeah.
which is another reason I wanted to talk to you. You know, this is your second cycle.
Yeah, and we didn't change
second-
anything from last year. I think Matt is a little bit of a Slate genius, and he did a really great job of setting it up in Slate last year so that it requires as little thinking as possible from us, so that we really don't have to be like putting a lot of thought into whether we should be using the transcript or the test scores or both. It's really nice to have someone who's running Slate who knows how to create a system that requires very little thought as you're going through the process.
Hillary, this is awesome. I think of all the conversations, this may be the most I've gotten into talking about how the professional training that's done when you're creating your rubric, and how every attempt is made to block out biases and to standardize the process and have calibration.
Yeah, and we try to do it better every year. I mean, every year when we get together for reader training, it really is a collaborative exercise where our leadership, to their credit, are looking for feedback on how we do things and how we can tweak things to make it easier for us to read and more fair. I don't know if fair is the right word to use, but more fair for the students in the process. And then really spending time like digging into the ways that we read and how to make sure that we make it as easy for the students as possible, remove as much stress as we can, and yet also get a really thorough read on students.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was great to talk to you.
Always is great, Hillary. Always awesome. Thank you for the good work.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, it's time for part 3, which is the final part of my interview with Rob Franek, editor-in-chief of the Princeton Review. And we're looking at the topic of what can you learn from all the research that Princeton Review does by surveying 420 students on average per campus of the schools they feature in the book. And in part 3, Rob talks about a brand new question they added this year. What are the most conservative, what are the most liberal schools? He talks about how they determined that list. Rob talks about another question they ask, who has the best career services? And he shares who got the best survey results this year from that questions from students. And he also shares some perennial schools that consistently are always at the top on that question every year. Rob talks about who showed up at the top of their list when it came to the question of who has the most Greek life. I asked Rob about whether it makes sense for a parent or a student to check the results out from their survey for multiple years as a way of accessing hundreds more surveys, and particularly if you're interested in one of their 50 survey categories. I asked Rob to elaborate on what else they will get if they pick up the Best 390 Colleges book, besides just the research in the 50 categories. Rob talks a little bit more about some of the other resources Princeton Review has, and we close out with our tradition. Rob goes on the hot seat in our lightning round. Listen and enjoy. Now, I know you added a couple new categories this year: most conservative students, most liberal students, most politically active students, least politically active. Good timing with the election. I'm sure you were thinking smartly on that. What questions did you ask that allowed you to rank, in categories, most liberal and most conservative students, and who showed up on your list? I know our listeners are probably curious as the most conservative and most liberal schools.
Yeah, we do try to keep it a 1-to-1 ranking list. So if there's one question we can add in, then we can, add that, and then we can create a ranking list from there. Now, some of our lists are hybrid. There might have 2 or 3 question types there. But when we're thinking about most conservative students, this year's Thomas Aquinas, I've already mentioned it, Thomas Aquinas Small School, it is conservative. It's in California, and it has been on any number of lists that kind of have that through line, conservative, religious schools. And again, these are intentionally curated lists, not intentionally curated lists, but the 390 is an intentionally curated list so that we have both public and private schools, pretty close to even, but large schools and small schools, urban, suburban, and rural. When we're thinking about this, I want there to be great diversity that students can choose. So number one, most conservative is Thomas Aquinas in California. Most liberal, Mount Holyoke, which I was to not too long ago when I was visiting UMass, and probably trues up, Mark, to your experiences at both, or what you would summarize as a student, thinking about both of those schools. Fine schools academically, but different when it comes to political life on campus.
Yeah, and what questions? What's the exact question that you kind of asked to suss that out in your survey?
Yeah, so we asked them very specific. I'll just look it up here. Based on students' assessment of their personal political views. So that's one question, and then we'll take, again, 170,000 students, but 430. On average per campus, and we'll look to those, then we'll split out the margins, or we'll split out the ends of the spectrum on that. And those are the schools that will appear in the top 25 on either side.
Yeah, but once again, I looked at that. I said, okay, you look at the list, and for example, on the conservative, Hillsdale, we know Hillsdale's conservative. High Point, we know that's conservative. Right? Wofford and Clemson and University of South Carolina, Columbia. Like, all those schools are not surprising at all. And then on the liberal schools, you see some of the similar ones, Sarah Lawrence and some of the others. So yeah, once again, reaffirms sort of what those of us in the profession know. But it's something increasingly that comes up more and more and more in the counseling room. And so, there's people that don't care about the politics. They couldn't care less, and that's fine. There's also others that want a school to, it's a whole thing about people look for their people, right? Find their tribe. And if people feel very strongly about this topic, I have it on both sides in the counseling room. I was talking to a Florida student. He's like, he's very big on, I don't want any woke factor. So he'd love this list on the conservative side. And then we have the others on the other side as well. So, and this is just one area. Let's get into some of the other categories and talk a little bit about the question you ask and sort of how you determined it and which colleges emerged at the top. So let's go with best career services. What are you asking to suss that out, and who shows up at the top this year on that?
Yeah, but for best career services, and we specifically asked, so based on student ratings of their scores, of their school's career and job placement services, right? So number one on the list is, again, a usual suspect here, Mark. It is Bentley University, 12-ish miles outside of downtown Boston. Bentley is like a Northeastern, also in Boston, that have such a culture around creating those either cooperative experiences, learning communities, experiential learning. And again, it all kind of means the same thing. What are students doing outside the classroom to complement what they're learning inside the classroom? And the nomenclature changes in how schools label it, but it has a through line continuity to it. So Bentley University, number one. Southwestern, I mean, this is a powerhouse school just a little outside of Austin. Now that's where Tesla's putting up their new plant. I don't know if you know Laura Trombley. She's the relatively new president. She got the presidency at Southwestern over the pandemic, and she was Pitzer's president for a long time. But she's creating a liberal arts city. I mean, they have a huge they're huge landowners in that area of Georgetown, Texas, where they live. But it's one of the fastest growing cities in the States. So anyway, just that idea of how are students in a small 1,800-ish student population at Southwestern, how are they now being endeared to the outside community, literally into the fastest growing or one of the fastest growing suburb cities, in the States? And the answer is they're doing it pretty well, right? I mean, they're combining that liberal arts ideal with an urban environment through a job, through an experiential learning lens. And that, to me, answers and I think gives the salve for a lot of the cost questions and debt questions that we had talked about before. Because if you're feeling that there's great return on your academic investment and financial investment if you're a student and family, this is a great value. Yeah. And Kansas State, I mean, these are some usual suspects. Wabash, Claremont McKenna, another one of the 5. We can go on and on about these schools, but there is just a powerhouse of awesomeness on this list.
Yeah, let's talk about another category, Greek life. Lots of Greek life. How are you asking that, and who emerged at the top for the Greek life questions?
Yeah, and you brought this up before. These ideas of out of the 50 categories, there are channels. There are subcategories, right, that kind of group them together. And this is in our social scene category. We chatted about some of these already. But lots of Greek life based on student ratings of popularity of fraternities and sororities at their particular school, right? So thinking about what Greek life is like on campus and asking students their experiences. Number one, Central Pennsylvania, awesome school academically, Bucknell University, powerhouse school academic, but there is an incredibly active Greek scene on campus. And this is stuff that, again, you and I have been talking about schools for a long time and can synthesize this down for students, but we can't assume that every college-bound student knows that likely is going to be part of their social life experience at Bucknell, but we can help tell them, we can help direct them in that area. And this ranking list does just that. Wofford College, number 2. Auburn is on there again, your neighbor 70 miles away. DePauw, Kettering, Wabash, Transylvania. These are just schools that are, again, I think usual suspects to us, but is revealing to a college-bound student and even a parent, whether they went to school or not. If they did go to school, they'd been out of school 25 years, and they're either learning or relearning the college process with their kids and first-generation families as well. I mean, these are valuable to both ends of the spectrum.
I'm not just saying this to get you to sell some more books, but it might be worth it for a family to pick up a couple of your editions so that they get a exposure to another set of 300-400 people for these are important things. I've seen, for example, Richmond be way up at the top for your career services. And I know their career services are amazing, but then, you're serving different people. One year it might be 12th, one year it might be one year it might be, it might be in someone's best interest that really values this to not just look at 1 year, but a couple years. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'm happy you brought that up, Mark, because you're right. Their schools can and do change from year to year. There is some continuity to, as you're noting, some usual suspects on some ranking lists. To fall from one to off the list is, not normal, or it's not the norm. But to move around in the ranking list, absolutely. And as we talked about before, schools continuously change, right? And we could just talk about it from the career service perspective. Georgia Tech has been, a leader in career services, as University of Florida, as Bentley has, as Vanderbilt has, but other schools can create a career development center of note. And that can have a direct and near immediate impact on a current college student. And hence, they would likely answer pretty positively on their student survey for the Princeton Review. So to me, it is the virtuous cycle, Mark, and that feels right to me because schools can change, students note that change, and then they give their opinions to us, and we can create this resource around it. That's the idea.
Well, when I say that, I'm thinking about it not so much to find out if the school is fourth versus if they slip to 18th, but more a matter of, surfacing some other schools in a category that's really important. So, for example, let's say someone says, wow, best classroom experience. That's like extremely important to me. So I like the 25 that are listed here. But if I look at another year, maybe there'll be, 4 or 5 that made it on there that didn't make it. And now maybe I have 30 or 35 I might want to look at. It's just, it's just, I personally, I mean, maybe I'm expressing my nerdy geekiness. Lisa is a co-host on our podcast, and she was happy to know you were coming on because you came to Vernon Hills and spoke at the school there when her oldest daughter was a junior. But we were talking to this morning, and she's like, she marks up all back copies and gets really nerdy geeky. But I do that too. But that's, our listeners are that kind of listeners. So it's just not a bad idea if it's something that's really important to you. Maybe career placement's really important. Maybe classroom experience is really important. When I look at back copies, I'm thinking of it more as curating some additional schools that I may want to look at, as opposed to, let's see if you're number 2 or number 22.
Oh, yeah, this makes complete sense to me. And you're right. Thinking about that from, how data can change over year to year, extending that list from 25 to 35 or whatever. Yeah, that makes such good sense to me. Yeah, totally. And you know what? Now I remember I was looking up, there were 2 other colleagues, Becky and Amy from Vernon Hills, because I think I ever talked to her maybe twice outside of Chicago. Yeah, so I totally remember Lisa. Yeah, that's awesome.
Talk about the book too. And that's my last question for you, unless you have something else to add that we haven't included yet, Rob. What are some other things they would get in the book? Because, you have your safety ratings and your academic, you do you take the surveys and sort of quantize the data into like 100-point scales. Talk a little bit about that. We haven't gotten into some of the other stuff that's laid out in the book that you use the survey data to share.
Yeah, there's a couple of different things. And so as we talked about before, 2-page profiles for each schools. The narrative there is all, again, based on student opinion. So you'll see those, so students will see those quotes. We asked specifically, we have a section specifically about financial aid, as we talked about such a key issue, just thinking about that from how schools are dealing with financial aid. Are they need blind? Are they need aware? We do give schools the ability to give a snapshot of themselves based on their own words. But I do think it's incredibly valuable, in addition to the rankings that we talked about and the student narrative, the driven narrative from students, that we do have a lot of ratings in there, from fire safety to quality of life to professors, thinking about professors interesting. Are they interesting? Are they accessible outside of class? So again, there are any number of data points that a student should be able to read one profile from this book, whether it's in the book or online, and they can walk away with a deep understanding of what that school is like. And that should help inform them for continued conversation with their counselors, with their friends, with ultimately, if they visit the school virtually or in person, doesn't matter. And we understand that can build, again, a conversation of substance and ultimately one of confidence. There is one thing
and also very generous. Go ahead.
No. That's I appreciate that, and that's, to me, that's the conversation that we're hoping for. And that, as you said before, you can't learn everything. I love being a student. I know a heck of a lot about schools. I don't want that to be finite, right? I want schools continue to change. That's the glory of college admission, right? And that's why we've been doing this stuff for a long time, because it continues to change. And that, to me, is a delight.
And I will say you're very generous with what the free information that you put on the website too. I mean, that sort of shows the service that you're providing for the nation there. You could have all of this stuff behind a paid firewall. You're quite generous with what you put up and give away for free. So is there anything we haven't shared today, Rob, that you'd want our listeners to know?
We do a bunch of other ranking lists at Princeton Review as well. I actually have one coming out today on best entrepreneurship. I bring this up because in the front matter of the book, in addition to the student surveys, I try to give students a snapshot of other ranking lists that we do. Again, many of them based on student opinion, but we have different verticals. Entrepreneurship on the undergraduate side of the fence, on the graduate side of the fence. Just thinking about those things and then thinking about majors. And I'm sure you get this question all the time from your counselees, but a school that has the best, psychology major. It's hard for you and I to answer that because we know that schools are so different. But giving students some guidance on schools that have really well subscribed, right, majors in psychology, or they have a great career placement for those students. They might not be going on to graduate school right away, but again, just thinking about extending the conversation for students so that they can feel confident to have it again and again as they're going through this process.
Well, Rob, we have a tradition. I can't break it. No first-time guest gets away without going on the hot seat, our lightning round. So you ready for a couple quick non-college questions?
Are they SAT questions? Okay. All right.
No SAT. So how do you relax? How do you unwind? How do you chill?
Oh God. I love to fish. And I'm a decent fly fisherman. I'm a pretty good bass fisherman, but I'm a decent fly fisherman. I live in New York City, and I grew up mostly in New York City as well. So I don't get to fish all that often, but I've been doing it for a long time, and I do it a lot during the summer.
So where's your hot spot to fish? Where do you recommend if someone says, "Hey, give me a fishing recommendation"?
Yeah. Well, we have my dad grew up in Pennsylvania, so we have right outside of State College, so about 12 miles from State College. So we have his house that he grew up in, and his brothers and sisters. So we still have that as a family house. So I spend a lot of time out there. But Central Pennsylvania is like the most famous of these limestone streams, and we're all catch and release. But I'll send you a couple of pictures, Mark, if you want to geek out with me. But I mean, catch and release of the biggest trout I've ever seen in my life over the last 2 years. We've done super well.
What's a pet peeve Rob has? Something that grinds your gears.
I hate it when speakers read slides to people in a presentation setting that can full well read themselves. It bothers me so deeply, I would leave a room, Mark, virtually or in person. And I speak, as we talk about, I spend a lot of time on the road. I speak give talks for a living, and I don't have a lot of patience for when people and wasting time just reading slides to people. So that's a big pet peeve.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, let's close with this one. What's your best advice for three groups: counselors, students, and parents? Those are our three constituents that listen.
Yeah. For counselors, I love the idea. We talked about this before of continuously being a student. And I work with counselors all the time. They are all believing this. So this idea of continuously learning about this process and being able to relay that to any students, parents, any one of their constituents. For students, I'm thinking, listen, there is a best fit school out there for you. That might sound corny, but the truth is that out of the nearly, over 2,300 schools that are here just in the States, there are any number that can be best fits for you. And this process, to me, is a glorious one. And to parents that might be slogging through this with their families, again, whether you went to school or not, you're either learning or relearning this process with your kids. And that is a joy. I mean, when you find, young people find a school that they love, you can tell it from them. They're so confident and they're so happy. And this is going to be something that they carry with them through the rest of their lives. This is not an insignificant decision, and it can feel weighty, but again, it is knowable and navigable, and it can be awesome.
Rob, this has been great. I really appreciate it. Thanks for giving us an hour of your time, and keep doing what you're doing. Love your high energy. I see why you got hired in admissions. That's all. You always have to be enthusiastic too, right? But to get other people enthusiastic. So a lot of us out here in the profession really appreciate it, and I love your excellence. So thank you for coming on.
Mark, such a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really, really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you.
Awesome.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, last week, Kevin and I discussed safe universities overseas. We'll continue now with part 2 of what will be a 4-part series. I can see some listeners thinking, everything you say I agree with. Get to the bottom line. Like, where should I avoid or where should I go?
I think, and I hope everyone will forgive me, but just because we've got a number of different ideas of safety overseas to cover, and I don't want to get
Yeah.
bogged down in this one, is if you're looking for more open societies, where if you're a woman, a person of color, a member of the LGBTQ community, you're going to be more readily accepted, and not just accepted, but embraced, because we don't want to be accepted. We want to be, we want people to be embraced.
Mm-hmm.
You definitely are looking at places like Scandinavia, you're looking at Ireland, you're looking at the Netherlands. I think I feel pretty comfortable the larger cities in those countries saying if you're looking at a university that's of some global reputation, we don't want to play the prestige game here, but you're going to find your people. There's always the chance you're going to find some jerk as well.
So what about the UK? Because that's obviously a popular place.
I think you have to really kind of dig into what your comfort level is. I personally think that the three most popular Scottish universities, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and St. Andrews, I hear people occasionally mention that, it's not like it's 20% American or something at this point.
Right.
They do a great job of this. I think schools in London itself do a really good job of this. I feel that schools I hate to reduce this to some degree to politics, but if you look at an electoral map of the UK, and it's a little bit of a flip for us because the red is Labour and the blue is the Conservatives in the UK. If you look at those Labour strongholds, Lib Dems could go either way, but those Labour strongholds, the cities in the Midlands and the North, those are going to be more welcoming. And again, it's not that you're suddenly going to be finding yourself in a dangerous situation. It's just that we want to make sure that you're someplace where you're welcomed with open arms. I feel that the larger cities in Australia and New Zealand does everything beautifully, but I feel larger cities in Australia really do a great job of it.
Are there places that you would say, not sure I would go there if I were you, or buyer beware? What can give me the opposite?
I think once you get into smaller towns in more conservative, more socially conservative areas, I have not recommended any place south of Rome in Italy to any student ever. And that's not to say that there aren't some great universities down there. It's just, it doesn't necessarily gel.
And also I do want to give the caveat on this because we're all about fit and match. So you prefaced this conversation, a lot like if this is of concern to you, right? This particular acceptance, celebration, embracing, and I know you're gonna move into more other areas of safety like wars and violence.
Right.
And I think it's great the lens. I was hoping that you would use a multifaceted look at safety.
Well, I think it's a great segue into the wars and violence because some place that I used to recommend wholeheartedly for a number of students was, the Gulf region, which I know is shocking, but especially places like the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, the universities are superb. They're very stable, but what we're starting to see a little bit is due to events, and again, we could talk all day about who's right, who's wrong. I don't want to get into the weeds on that. But due to, shall we say, heightened geopolitical tensions, there's, I'm not sure if I recommend some of those places. And, let's be honest, I'm not recommending someplace in Dubai or the American University of Sharjah to an LGBTQ student. I'm just not doing that thing. It is increasingly where we have to look through another lens. And it's one that, I sometimes do feel a little self-conscious about asking is, if you're a member of certain religious groups, I feel that I don't want to go back to the 30s, and I was speaking to a parent of a Jewish student not so long ago, and I said, some of the places that we were discussing for them are in Amsterdam. And Amsterdam recently had some protests that there were certainly, I don't want to say fringes because I don't want to minimize of it, but there were certainly some moments that seemed very anti-Semitic. And this particular parent, emailed back, and it broke my heart reading it because he said, "We've been running for 4,000 years. We're used to it. We where could we go if not this?" And it breaks my heart because the student, under normal times, someplace like the American University of Sharjah or even the American University of Cairo would be perfect for this kid. Because they crave this international environment that is focused on building peace and understanding.
Can I have a question for you? So obviously, Ukraine, Russia, there's a lot going on there. Does that at all impact any recommendations?
Absolutely. I know, because one of the big appeals of going overseas is the cost savings. And you can find some great deals in Eastern Europe where they teach in English, the tuition is very affordable. I have severe reservations about recommending, say, a Baltic state, or even, and it breaks my heart to a degree to say this because I think they're amazing opportunities, someplace like Poland or Czechia, because I have all sorts of students ask about Charles University in Prague. I think it's a great place. I am definitely reining in who I'm recommending to go to that. And, I'll have the conversation with the student and the parent and be like, this is someplace I would recommend, but as someone who, does also live in this political risk world, I want you to understand the risks associated with that this is...
I have a question for you.
Sure.
By the way, like I said, I'm in the Outer Banks at a resort. I hope my sound is not despicable. I'm doing the best I can with sound here. There are a lot of people that think Putin is likely to topple Ukraine and then set his sights on Poland. Is that the reason why you don't recommend Poland? Because you're looking ahead to what you think might happen, or is it just already bad already, even if that doesn't come to fruition?
It's definitely looking ahead. And it's just...
You don't want someone to be there 2 years and then they got to come back or go through literally maybe your life's at stake. I mean, any of that stuff.
I think back to my own experience studying abroad. I was in Jordan in 2006, and this was about the time Israel and Hezbollah mixed it up. And Israel launched ground incursion into Lebanon to weed out Hezbollah. I had a really good friend who, instead of studying abroad for the summer in Jordan, studied abroad for the summer in Beirut. And he got evacuated in essentially a glorified landing craft to Cyprus. And while it makes a great story at cocktail parties, it's terrifying. I believe, I could be wrong, but the late Anthony Bourdain had a similar experience on No Reservations that he talked about. I kept watching, the B-roll of the show to see if my buddy was, on the same craft. But it's something that, you take a certain amount of responsibility in where you're recommending. You try to account for things like that. You try to make sure that even if everything else looks crazy, it's going to be someplace where this kid's going to academically and socially thrive. And I think certain places that are right there on the border where we've already seen, there are mishaps. We just in the last 48 hours, Russia tested a new missile that had 6 integrated warheads that can target. Each of them could target 6 other targets. And this is not a reflection on the Russian military. This is a reflection on human error, that when you have that many munitions flying around, a difference of a couple hundred miles, it's too close to comfort for me. There have already been situations where people on the Polish side have perished, and I don't want to hide behind that. At one hand, I want people to go live their lives. I think that you don't surrender, at the first threat, but at the same time, I'm comfortable saying that as a 38-year-old guy. I'm not comfortable asking a 17 or 18-year-old to get them psyched up about someplace that, like you said, in 2 years, they might be trying to catch the last EasyJet flight out. And I just ethically, I have to give a huge grain of salt with that.
And I'm sure your families appreciate it. So let's flip it 180. What are the places that, if crime is a real concern for you in this country, and maybe that's not the only reason you want to go overseas, but it's maybe one of 5 or 10 reasons. Maybe, the cultural experience, all these other things, close to family, whatever, maybe be your top reason, but it's one of the important things to you. What are the places that you feel, I feel very comfortable here because crime stats beat most U.S. schools?
I think, unfortunately, it's going to be the same kind of countries to avoid in terms of, we're going to see the same countries coming up again and again.
Well, I'm not talking about the avoiding. I'm talking about running too.
But I mean, it's we definitely like Australia. We like New Zealand. We like Scandinavia. We like Canada. We like a lot of Western European countries, and we can get into the debates. There's a lot of options. That gives you a lot of options. It really does, and I think that again, it's about what your risk appetite is. I think that it's you're going to see more crime in, say, the East End of London than you're going to see in St. Andrews, but it's going to be a different kind of crime. You're still going to have some, shall we say, pretty bad things happen. There is the chance that somebody has a drink spiked, or that a $1,500 tennis bracelet is stolen out of somebody's room when they're having a party or something like that. Do you feel like London is London, or do you feel within London, no, this place is just located in a much safer neighborhood within London than this place? I think it's all relative to the U.S., because we can sit here and we can bash someplace in the East End, where Jack the Ripper hung out. But the truth of the matter is, when I'm in London, I go to the East End. It's not like it's someplace that I live here in Dallas. And there are some parts of Dallas that I don't particularly want to go to after dark. Unfortunately, it's where all the cool bars and clubs and restaurants are. So, sometimes the friends went out, but a lot of that too is, Mark, I'm old and I like to be at home by 9 p.m. This concludes part 2 of 4 of the series Kev's doing for us on Safe Universities Overseas. We hope you join us next week for part 3. Friends, on Monday's episode, Julie and I reflect on a couple trends we're observing from colleges based on the decisions they have released so far and the policies that they are enacting. Next, we start a brand new interview with Christoph Gutentag, Dean of Admissions at Duke University and 33-year veteran, and we're discussing how does Duke make admissions decisions. It's a 3-parter that's going to go live on January 27th, February 4th, and February 11th on Mondays. Friends, I've been thinking a lot about the seniors, many who will make admissions decisions in the next 3 months. And last week I shared a quote with you from Steve Jobs, founder of Apple. And Jobs released that quote when he had pancreatic cancer. He was 55 years old and he knew he only had a couple months to live. And Jobs simply said, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life." Well, now I want to quote Steve Jobs again because I feel he said something else that was profound that also applies to seniors making admissions decisions. Here's what Jobs said. "Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice." Did you catch that? Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website.
You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Matvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.